It's the fourth time now as well that I have the pleasure of introducing Derek. And I'm going to do exactly the same thing like last year, where I just want one thought that everybody takes away, for hearing from Derek Yach, which is that throughout his entire career, many of you know about it, he's been a relentless fighter against smoking, to stop smoking. He pursues every avenue he can find to combat the smoking epidemic as we know it. So, Derek, the floor is yours again for the proceedings of the day to start, and please give him an applause. Thank you.
Well, good morning to everybody, and wonderful to see you all here. And to remind you that the elephant is still in the room, as you'll see above us. It's always scary how fast the time passes, and I'm not going to go into an update on everything since last year. But let me just start off by thanking the incredible team of Martin, Kylie, Robert, and Michelle for putting this meeting together again. And I think a big round of applause is due to them. The planning for these kind of meetings actually begins today for next year, as it always does. And we're always keen to get your sense of gaps and opportunities and try and anticipate what's going to happen over the next year. As Robert said, just a few comments about the program, and then I'm going to go straight into a couple of opening words and also hopefully start with some time because we've got far better speakers than me ahead of us. I think the focus on regulatory and trade issues is fully understandable given the massive shifts that we're seeing in everything from tariffs and trade policy and the upending of the world trade system. It will have implications for areas of work. Some of those will be touched upon. And I think we'll have some extremely thoughtful discussions on those. This will be an issue that we'll be looking at over the next few years, I suspect. Secondly, the advance in science and evidence, and some really practical examples of where we're starting to see success, I hope will come through. And we've got far more examples of success growing every year. One big theme will also be upon who is benefiting and who's not yet benefiting from access to tobacco harm reduction products, and that's a panel that Rachel will chair later. The intent to go after oral nicotine and the innovations and the potential is really based on that perhaps being one of the big stories of the year, that we've seen a massive upsurge by large companies, small companies, different types of innovations around the world, moving the oral nicotine program ahead. And it may be one of the few examples where we're seeing support coming from a very wide variety of folk across the political, the financial, the academic sector that I think augurs well potentially for the future. Anybody who goes down to Wall Street, by the way, will find that there are probably too many expelled pouches around the outside of the trading store, which are keeping the traders awake these days. As you'll see if you walk around Central Park, you'll find them as well, warning us that excess use is already giving round to waste, but the use has gone up through the roof. And then finally, none of this is possible without investment. And I think the discussion on the investment landscape in the last session is what also makes this meeting fairly unique, is that we've got researchers, innovators, and investors all talking about issues at the same time. So hopefully this will be an exciting program for you, and we hope that there'll be enough time, both in the formal and in particularly in the informal sessions, to have high degrees of discussion. So with that, let me move to make a couple of comments as we think about why we have this meeting here now, and remind people that every year for the previous 3 years, this was obviously on the eve of the UN General Assembly. But this year we can truly say that we're at a pivotal moment for global health. This year coincides with the UN high-level meeting that later this week will focus on NCDs and mental health. And we know that the urgency couldn't be greater, given that in WHO's own report, it says that the targets for NCDs are off target, their words, which basically means that millions of people continue to die prematurely from preventable, poorly managed conditions such as cancer, heart disease, and chronic lung disease. These, as we know, are not just statistics, and some of the work I've done has allowed me to start looking deeper into low middle income countries where you can see the pain and suffering that this causes around the world. Last week, the WHO released a new report that prioritizes sweeping tax increases on tobacco, sugary sodas, and alcohol, framing these as the cornerstone of the strategy to get NCD program back on track. The report warns against industry interference at every turn, yet it fails to acknowledge the promise of industry-led innovations. And I've been spending a lot of time looking at the innovations we've seen over the last few years, not just in our field. GLP-1 agonists for obesity and diabetes are cutting the stigma that so many people with obesity suffer and opening the door for the first time to getting obesity levels down. Tobacco harm reduction products are doing the same in our fields of tobacco control. And groundbreaking immunotherapies coming out of the oncology and the pharmaceutical industry are making survival where that seemed impossible possible, and not just for advanced industrialized countries. Those who smoke, live with mental health, cancer, or obesity, we know are too often marginalized, compounding the challenges they face and impeding public health programs. This tax-centric approach is an unprecedented contraction, in my view, of global health funding and is really a response to the deep cuts in WHO's budget. Anybody reading the last few months will have seen that there have been horrific cuts imposed both by the administration here, but also by the German and British government on global health. These are the deepest, largest cuts we've experienced in 3 decades. And the financial constraints will particularly be felt in the area of NCDs, who are starting to actually see the benefit of being part of the broader global health agenda. This will obviously affect us in tobacco control. That's why we're here at this new partnerships meeting, to see whether we can chart a smarter path forward. We know that we have 1 billion people worldwide who smoke, and it's exhausting to keep giving the figures, and about 8.5 million people every year lose their lives from tobacco products. Despite decades of global advocacy, the WHO's Framework Convention, the smoking rates have declined on average, but not in some of the major low-middle-income countries. Let's remember that in countries like China and Indonesia, male smoking rates still exceed 50%. 50%. A level comparable to what the OECD faced in the 1960s. That's not progress. While the OECDs have made some progress, and some pretty dramatic progress, much of the world is still trapped in a cycle of widespread cigarette addiction. And even across the OECD, we're seeing the rates among women rising relative to men. And in most of the OECD, lung cancer death rate in women are higher than breast cancer death rates by far, something we don't talk about enough. Compounding the challenge is the global funding that I mentioned. And without that funding and new sources of funding, it really is going to behove industry, nonprofits, and enlightened new players to do more. So the current approach by WHO, to remind us, is to increase the tobacco tax by 50%. And many countries are requiring that they have equal taxes on harm reduction products and cigarette products. The consequence of this, we know, will have disastrous effects. First, steep hikes fuel illicit trade. And to put it in context, about 50 to 60% of cigarettes on the South African market are now defined as illicit. This is something that grew fast out of the ban on cigarettes during the pandemic. When prices soar, black markets thrive, criminal networks expand, and public health objectives are undermined. This is well known. Many of you in the room have known this for decades. You've documented it for decades. Yet, unfortunately, the leaders of the report, funded by Bloomberg, include allegedly some of our great economists, including Larry Summers, and great financiers, Michael Bloomberg, seem oblivious to the fact that this is going to have these disastrous effects. And it's not just illicit trade and criminal elements. I always remind people that it was in this city, in 2002, that the UN hosted a meeting on illicit trade and terrorism. And this was something that the Alcohol and Tobacco Firearms wanted to do to bring attention to the consequence of smuggling of cigarettes from North Carolina to Canada, leading to the first terrorism case where the funding was going off to support Hezbollah. That is still a reality across many parts of the world, where we have no idea where the excess profits are going. And it's very likely that they are going into more than the illicit trade and criminal element. The second consequence of increasing the taxes, and particularly equalizing the taxes, is that if you treat harm reduction products equally, we know that it'll stop people switching or keep people smoking and therefore increase the death rate. If we're truly committed to ending smoking, we need to avoid these prohibitionist policies. The rest of the meeting, we know, will focus on the way forward that you know so well. We must embrace harm reduction. We must eliminate unnecessary regulatory and ideological barriers and foster the environment where innovation can thrive. And let's always remember that the one error we all made in the Framework Convention was to avoid the words innovation, patents, and new knowledge, even though harm reduction was one of the original objectives of the Framework Convention. The government should be encouraging, not stifling, the development and scale-up of safer nicotine products. The private sector must be engaged as full partners, and we know that their exclusion and prohibition is really unacceptable and is not in line, in my view, with the true legal interpretation of 5.3, which is being used as a ruse to block discussion among non-parties to the convention who should have the full right to engage. History shows that harm reduction works. We have Mark Tyndall with us, and we're really thrilled and privileged to have you here, Mark. His work has shown the power of needle exchanges, opioid substitution therapies, and a wide range that fall within a human rights approach. And we hope that we'll be able to do far more to adopt and use the harm reduction approach to address our work. So let me just end by saying that we always have a choice. We could spend the whole meeting being critical of the failings of the current players, or we could say, what can we be doing to actually make progress at a faster rate, whether or not they're going to give us support. And I hope we take more of the latter. And knowing many of the work that you're doing around these tables is already well underway, I think this should be a year in which we start making even more progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Derek. For our next speaker, please, Dr. Mark Tyndall, with a very exciting title, Sex, Drugs, Motorcycles, and Cigarettes.
Thank you very much. My pleasure to be here today, and thanks for the invitation. I'm supposed to talk about harm reduction in 10 minutes, so I'll give it my best shot. For those of you who came in, you may see that I recently published a book, and I'll be referring to some of that as I go. So I start my book with a confession that I am an accidental vaping activist. Although I was a hospital-based academic physician and saw firsthand the devastating health consequences of smoking cigarettes, I generally went along with my medical colleagues and the messaging coming out of public health institutions. Basically, cigarettes are bad, the people who use them are bad, the companies that make them are bad, and that we are doing a pretty good job of reducing consumption through our abstinence-based policies. High taxes, expansion of non-smoking zones, graphic pictures on packaging, and shaming campaigns that characterize people who smoke as weak, selfish, and stupid. Now, I had nothing to do with these campaigns personally, but I didn't feel a reason to challenge them. For people who smoked, there seemed to be very few options beyond quitting, and slowly tightening the noose of prohibition were all that we had. This is not how I viewed prohibition in other drugs. In fact, I was a staunch opponent. I knew that the predictable consequences of prohibition, social chaos, more dangerous drugs, arrests, violence, and more death is met with even more extreme prohibition, and the cycle continues. The main victims of prohibition are people who choose to use illegal drugs. Few would have predicted that this cycle would now include people who smoke cigarettes and use nicotine products. Around 2011, I first heard about vaping. This seemed like a cool idea and was really the definition of harm reduction. Taking an activity, smoking cigarettes, that was very risky and making it much safer. I was an expert in harm reduction. My whole medical career revolved around reducing risk. I was involved in setting up and evaluating needle exchange programs, supervised injection sites, and safe supply programs to make drug use less lethal. I knew through personal experience the resistance to harm reduction when it came to hard drugs like heroin, cocaine, and crystal meth. But to nicotine, I had no idea. How could promoting a product that made using nicotine 95% safer than smoking cigarettes face opposition? From tobacco control, from public health, from cancer agencies. It didn't make any sense in 2011, and it makes even less sense in 2025. Now, to illustrate my journey through harm reduction, I would quickly like to take you through 4 examples. The first is condoms. In 1989, as a newly minted infectious disease doctor, I went to work in Kenya during the peak of the HIV epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa. Besides letting people know that HIV was a real and present danger, condoms were the only effective prevention tool that we had. Despite being life-saving, condoms were vilified, and governments made accessing condoms difficult. Why? Because of a belief that it would lead to promiscuity among youth and encourage people to engage in sex without consequences. In this case, the consequences of HIV were death. Looking back, it is hard to imagine that this happened. Reducing access and spreading information about condoms was responsible for literally millions of HIV infections in Africa during that time. Needle exchange and distribution. In 1999, I arrived in Vancouver to work in HIV prevention among people who were using drugs. HIV was spreading quickly, with 30% of active drug users already infected. The transmission was due to needle sharing, and there was not enough needles around to support the massive numbers of injections that were happening in the community. The first needle exchange program had opened in the city around 1989 under intense scrutiny. It was based on a 1-to-1 exchange. You bring in a used needle, and we'll give you a clean one. For people injecting cocaine up to 40 times per day, this was just not good enough. We advocated for widespread distribution of needles, and after many years of intense advocacy, this was allowed. But why would anyone be against needle exchange in the first place? Because it was argued that it would be a temptation for young people to try injecting drugs if needles were easily accessible, and that there would be a few consequences for people who are already injecting drugs. The lack of clean needles in Vancouver and across North America has led to massive numbers of preventable HIV infections. Motorcycle helmets. I'm using this example not so much because it has been a cause that I have been directly involved with, but because it is such a great example of a proven harm reduction strategy that remains controversial. It remains controversial not because of the fear that is associated with interventions like condoms and needle exchanges, but because of personal agency and the right to choose. Ironically, the challenge to helmet laws comes from the very people who would benefit. They feel the government and public health institutions have no business telling them what to do, even if it could kill them. Finally, cigarettes and vaping. I will not go into the devastating health consequences of cigarettes or the need to find alternatives. Everyone can agree that cigarettes cause immense suffering and death. Vaping is the ultimate harm reduction intervention. Not only is it much safer and doesn't cause cancer, heart disease, or chronic lung disease, but it is so much better for the consumer. It doesn't smell up your clothes. It comes in a variety of flavors. It can be used discreetly. You don't need to have to stand there for 5 minutes and burn through a whole cigarette. It doesn't harm bystanders, and it doesn't leave toxic butts on our sidewalks or our oceans. And you won't burn your house down if you fall asleep while vaping. It does contain nicotine, the substance that people like to use. In fact, over 1 billion people can't seem to live without it and view early death by cigarettes as a reasonable trade-off. So in summary, harm reduction interventions are life-saving, effective, inexpensive, simple, and benefit the most vulnerable. So why are we so stuck? Well, I think vilification of vaping and other safer nicotine products is based on 4 primary things. The first is stigma and neglect of people who smoke cigarettes. No one really cares that much about people who smoke. It is their own choice, and if they're unable to stop smoking, it is ultimately their problem. But it is really more about social equity. Now just imagine if it was the richest 15% of people who smoke cigarettes instead of the poorest 15%. Do you really think that we would be having this conference? Do you think that if there was safe alternative to cigarettes that rich people would be denied? The second is inertia. Cigarettes have been with us for so long that they have become their own ecosystem, with everyone benefiting. It is not just the tobacco companies that profit, but so do cardiologists, respirologists, oncologists, the pharmaceutical industry, health-related charities, and most of all, governments who collect unprecedented taxation. Not that anyone takes pleasure in seeing people suffer and die, but no one is in a big hurry to upset this financial bonanza. Third, vilification of tobacco companies. Any alternative nicotine product, no matter how much safer, will not be supported if it comes from a tobacco company. No amount of investment in safer products or slick websites describing a push to go smokeless will matter to people in public health because of the past deception and massive profiteering from cigarettes. Fourth, risk aversion. How many times have I heard that it is too early to tell if vaping is safer than cigarettes? Or how do I know for sure that kids won't get hooked on nicotine and start smoking cigarettes? Or how do I know that nicotine won't lead to other drugs? Or how do I know what is really in e-liquids? Through elaborate campaigns based mainly on exaggeration and lies, these fears and many others have been magnified and have created this moral panic around vaping and safer nicotine. So as we spend the rest of today talking about nicotine, tobacco control, regulations, taxations, and markets, let us remember primarily that vaping and safer nicotine products are disruptive technologies that can radically improve the health of individuals and change global healthcare as we know it. These technologies will inevitably replace combustible tobacco. The only question is, how long will it take? With millions of lives in the balance, the sooner the better. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. That was excellent. 10 minutes, wonderful. The next speaker is Patricia Kovacevic, who is a global legal expert. Patricia, please come up to the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, as always, and it's always a pleasure to be here. The conference is getting bigger and making new and seeing old friends. Thank you very much. So my speech is going to focus on developments overseas in Europe, and in particular I will highlight one particular development that was just recent and tied into the TPD discussions and also some other anticipated developments. So we're going to talk about France, why and how the nicotine pouch ban happened. Of course, nicotine pouches, I hope everybody agrees, are the lowest risk profile of all nicotine products, with a very similar risk profile like nicotine replacement therapies. And whether we think they should be commercialized under this or that regulatory regime, there is no doubt that it does not help anyone except for the black market to ban these types of products. So we're going to discuss about what just happened in France. It's funny, right? Given the mess France has been in and all the turmoil and everything else, somehow among all of that, they had time to ban nicotine pouches as if it were this major priority. And we're going to tie it into the EU outlook, what to expect, and a few suggestions of a possible practical timeline of the new tobacco products directive, which will impact what is, let's remind ourselves, the biggest, probably the biggest potential reduced risk products market, probably bigger than the US because of the higher smoking incidence of the whole of the EU as a whole, or Europe as a whole, and also suggest some actions for operators, but also investors looking at France, EU, and so on. So what happened in France? The Minister of Health announced a potential ban back in 2024. She cited youth uptake of nicotine pouches, calls to poison centers, presumably for swallowing. Well, but again, people used to swallow detergent pods as well, and to what I recall, we haven't really banned those. And also the appeal of the products because they're flavored. Again, lots of things are flavored. And then finally, very recently, September 6th, the government published a decree which not only prohibits the production, import, export, and so on, but even possession and use is now basically criminalized. Of course, there was a procedure that had to be followed, a notification to the Commission of the draft decree under what's called the Tariffs procedure, the Technical Regulation Information System. This is EU's way to, under a transparency directive, to prevent changes in national law from creating unjustified barriers to trade within the EU internal market, which, of course, the EU, I don't know if you know about the structure, but it delegates certain things to national entities such as taxation, but wherever it's about trade, they try to minimize discrepancies among the laws to make sure that products can circulate freely among the EU countries. But this is not unprecedented. We did see Belgium, Netherlands, and Germany banning nicotine pouches, although in very different ways. Belgium, it was a royal decree, again, citing concerns that really are not scientifically substantiated. Netherlands announced a ban in 2003, which eventually became effective in 2025. Germany, interestingly, did not change the law. So Germany did not pass a law or decree or anything to ban nicotine pouches. Instead, one day, an inspector, a health inspector, decided, going to, I presume, a point of sale, that these products were food because you put them in your mouth. Now, I can think very tongue-in-cheek about a lot of things you put in your mouth and are not food, okay? But for some reason, they did have a food law, which of course said you cannot add nicotine to foods, understandably. I think this similar prohibition against adding nicotine to actual foods is just about everywhere in Europe, if not in the world. It's not an authorized food ingredient. However, from that, it escalated that basically all of a sudden the government said, now you cannot sell nicotine pouches anymore. And everybody was blindsided. No change in law, and they had been tolerated for a few years, and then all of a sudden you have to stop selling. Of course, this was challenged. It was challenged, but unfortunately unsuccessfully. So what are some of the legal implications? As I mentioned before, Tariffs actually prohibits not products, I should say, laws that are not harmonized at EU level must be pre-notified to the Commission. It actually helps reduce, but unfortunately doesn't help eliminate the issue. So also, there is a big concern about the divergence of classification of a product. So, in Germany, public health, it means it's not really harmonized with the other countries that, by and large, have regulated nicotine pouches. They have issued laws, which makes me personally think that a ban is unlikely in those countries that already have laws and collect taxes on nicotine pouches. And also, posturing, enforcement predictability is one of the most important things for governments, for regulators, for tax authorities, in particular on accessible goods. If you do not have a robust legal market that pays taxes, and if you as a manufacturer don't know for how long you will be able to continue to sell product in a particular country, it's very difficult to make plans, it's very difficult to collect taxes, and the only ones who benefit are the black market, who does not age verify, does not perform great quality control on their products, and generally fuel the proceeds of such illegal trade to very ungodly activities. There are some, of course, litigation options. Of course, in France, there could be legal challenges to this law. Unfortunately, in Germany, courts have largely sided with authorities. Now, Europe is one of those great places where, in spite of having a common market, countries and judges will still react differently to different types of legal challenges. Unfortunately, the whole of EU, as you know, except for Sweden, bans snus, which is a form of oral tobacco product, and a lot of public health officials and probably judges as well might be misled to think there are many more similarities between nicotine pouches and snus than they really are. And of course, just the mere fact that you basically are a criminal just by possessing and using nicotine pouches in France has to give us pause. It's really, there are a few countries in Asia that have that kind of prohibition, and it has to give us pause as to will it really be enforced, in particular in a country like France. Do they really prioritize the allocation of resources? France has a massive political problem and a massive drug problem. And the drug problem is much bigger. I have friends in law enforcement in France and relatives actually, much bigger than maybe anywhere else in Europe. And so focusing public health resources on basically stifling a product that actually helps, it just really diverts focus and resources to something completely irrational. In the EU, and this is probably the most important and interesting part of my very brief presentation, of course, the most important upcoming development is going to be the Tobacco Products Directive, and there is also a parallel directive on taxation, and really we expect both of these to sort of come to fruition, and in particular the TPD around 2028. Unfortunately, we have not seen the new TPD proposal. I have heard things that purport that they've seen it or heard people, but I have to yet see the official version, which is what I'm going to rely on. Bear in mind that normally when a version is published, in my experience, probably the final version is not all that different, but we still have an opportunity to advocate for a right outcome. I'm pretty sure nicotine pouches will be addressed, and it is most uncertain that there's going to be a heated debate. The fact that most countries have actually regulated and are taxing nicotine pouches makes me think, and also have manufacturing of different supply chain elements of the nicotine pouches, such as co-packers in different countries, and even nicotine pouches are manufactured in various countries. I would say it makes me think that it'll be very difficult to ban them, and of course completely irrational at TPD level. So what's there to do for operators, manufacturers, retailers, but also some of the public health? Oh, well, first of all, make sure at all times that you're compliant with law and regulation. That's my area of expertise, and I find that people prefer to come and seek advice once they hit trouble and not before, and it's really very simple to predict where things are going or be informed of where things are in a particular country, but also proactively between industry and public health, really try to model the excise scenarios, also prepare pre-market submissions for potential requirements for TPD, if that is going to be aligned with what's required now for vaping. In France, of course, the most important thing is to stay on the right side of the law, like in any country. I don't advise anyone to try to challenge the law in this manner, try to challenge the law before it's written, or ensure that it's properly drafted. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Patricia. Now for our next speaker, it is Deanna Okun. She is formerly with the International Trade Commission. She was the commissioner and chair, and she's now with the law firm Polsinelli. We're absolutely delighted to have her here and very privileged. It's the first time that she's joining us in this forum, and she will be educating us around issues of trade and intellectual property and all the good stuff. So Deanna, please come up.
Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to join you. Again, my first time appearing here, and I very much appreciate the invitation. I have to say, I think the organizers, Martin and others, must have been prescient. While I've done trade remedy law for 30 years, and I always enjoy speaking about it, the fact that the topic for this conference, which I guess you started planning a year ago on trade and tariffs and regulatory initiatives, I think probably in September of last year wasn't quite as interesting as it is in September of 2025. So I'm delighted to spend some time talking about that and the role of innovation and intellectual property protection, which Dr. Yach mentioned hadn't been a real focus of your efforts around this table, but is increasingly so. And hopefully I can give a little perspective from the regulatory framework. And again, I'll spend most of my time talking about the regulatory side of intellectual property, international trade, but my last couple of slides I will focus on more of the executive actions, tariffs and trade agreements, and some potential impact there as well. So I'm just going to orient you a little bit for those of you who are not from Washington. I know I spoke to some of you and you are from Washington, but as noted, I served as a commissioner on the U.S. International Trade Commission, which is a presidential appointment, Senate confirmed. But the ITC is fairly unique in that it was set up by Congress. While it's an executive agency, it's set up to be nonpartisan or bipartisan, depending on how you want to look at it. And so it has a lot of things set up. So this org chart, you don't have to pay too much attention to other than to understand there are 6 political appointees, the commissioners. They are served by a 400-person agency. In the intellectual property side, there are patent experts and science and technology backgrounds, and a general counsel's office that focuses on many of those areas, as well as industry experts in steel and aluminum and anything you can think about in international trade. And all of those folks, again, are working under a set of commissioners who vote on the cases in a quasi-judicial matter. The other thing that's unique, and I think I can use some examples to differentiate it, is again, with 6 commissioners, there's no more than 3 from one party. So no party, it was set up so that no party would have control. It's also unique in that in other agencies in Washington, most of them, in fact, you think FCC, Federal Communications Commission, FTC, Federal Trade Commission, the president appoints the chair when a new president comes in. So when President Trump came to office, he gets to appoint a new chair of all these other agencies. The ITC is set up differently. The chairmanship, while the president does designate a chairman, the chairman rotates between parties. So I served as chair under President Bush, and I served as chair under President Obama, because it had to go between the parties regardless of who's president. So that makes it quite unique in that you are not beholden to the president, and the terms are 9 years, again, set up so that a commissioner's term will outlast the president that appointed he or she, and therefore, hopefully you are acting very independently when you vote on all these cases, and you can't be reappointed. So again, it's a fairly unique agency. I don't want to spend too much time, but just so you understand its role, the mission of the ITC, and again, this is a statutory mission from Congress, is they adjudicate trade statutes directed at imports. I'm going to spend most of my short time with you talking about Section 337, but these are all unfair trade act statutes, right? So designed to remedy unfair trade practices, either intellectual property, dumping, selling at less than fair value, unfair subsidization. And so, again, when you think of the conversation that's going on about tariffs, a lot of the focus is is on kind of the cost of goods, but I'll spend a little bit more time talking about the IP side of it. The Commission also provides analysis to both the executive branch as well as to Congress on any type of issue. So the President or the Congress can turn and ask the ITC to study the competitiveness of any type of industry that then might lead to trade actions. And then the third thing, which again, no one paid attention to very much, even when I was there, is the ITC maintains a harmonized trade system. So these are all the codes in which we trade under. Most, and I know some of you I talked to last night are involved in businesses and you do trade. You know, your customs broker was in charge of, knowing what your HTS number is, how you get things in, how your supply chain was doing. I think, COVID focused attention on the fragility of supply chains, this president's actions to impose, tariffs around the world have really focused companies on what tariffs mean and how you mitigate tariffs, and I spend every day talking to companies about these things. So I can talk about that. I'm not going to make it the focus of my remarks, but the ITC implements all the changes. So they're extremely busy right now because there have been a few changes. This chart is just to, again, for those of you who are outside Washington, to help you understand that the ITC operates amongst the different agencies. So again, there are some things, and I'll talk about 337, where the President does review the Commission's findings and can disapprove them. There's interaction with the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, who's negotiating the trade agreements, and they talk to the ITC as well. And then certain of the cases, both the Department of Commerce and the ITC are adjudicating trade remedy cases. So I'm going to focus on Section 337. For those of you who have never heard this, and again, it's total Washington speak to think about numbers, and ask me any questions afterwards, but just think of Section 337 as a really strong unfair trade statute. And it was set up in the 1930s, so for those of you who know history, and there's been a lot of talk about Smoot-Hawley and what was going on, the ITC's in its modern form really starts in 1930. And the instructions were, we want a statute, or we want a remedy that's so powerful that US industries can thrive. And so the remedy that was given under Section 337 was to block imports. So again, in most trade regimes, when you think about regulating trade, tariffs are the preferred alternative, right? Yeah, you put a tariff on to try to level the playing field, make prices, closer in from what the U.S. side and the foreign country are doing. Section 337, different. Remedies, there's only one remedy. It's an exclusion order, blocking goods at the border. Extremely powerful. And that's why it has become a preferred forum for those who would like to enforce their intellectual property because of this remedy. And it's particularly important, and I think for this crowd, as you think about, when someone would go to the use Section 337 as opposed to patent enforcement at the district court, is speed to market, right? If you are a company whose products are being brought in and you have something really innovative, you'll get killed by the time you can, you go through a district court case, right? So the ITC really is designed to be a very efficient forum from when someone files a complaint until a remedy. It's about 18 months. It's not statutory, but the Commission tries to keep to those timetables, usually about half the time of a district court case. But it's a small forum, and you can see these from the numbers, and you may, I probably should have put the district court numbers on here, but there are lots and lots of patent infringement cases, unfair trade cases in district court. At the ITC, again, you're maybe getting 80 cases a year, but about half of all patent infringement trials that are heard or hearings actually happen at the ITC. And I'm just going to use this just as a short setup in terms of what is similar about ITC litigation or Section 337 litigation is a lot of cases settle, right? And many people, many complainants when they come to the ITC do want to try to force a settlement. In terms of determinations on the merits, you know, I will say this many times, I think the ITC is both product agnostic, technology agnostic, and I don't see it as being pro-complainant, pro-petitioner versus pro-respondent, but in particular years, obviously, you'll see on this chart that there have been years when, you know, the number of violations found. So again, the patent owner or the trade secret owner, trademark owner, copyright owner was able to convince the commission that there was a violation was fairly high. So I'm going to just spend a few minutes talking about vaping product cases at the ITC because there have been a number of them. And again, in an agency where there does tend to be some trends. So there were when I was at the ITC, we were in the middle of the smartphone wars, right? Every case was some version of a smartphone technology. There are a lot of medical products in general at the ITC right now, and vaping products in particular. And my clicker just went off. Oh, whoops, sorry, go back. Sorry, this is a little bit small in looking at it here, but just to give you a general sense, and please don't try to read all these, but we looked at vaping cases at the ITC since 2020. You'll see that Juul shows up the most times out of any single company. There's been a lot of litigation. I think one observation on this chart is you know, who the complainants have been. The second observation, if you look over on my far right column, on the outcome, is they have been very successful. Complainants at the ITC have been successful in obtaining a violation. The majority of times, you'll see only one no violation on there, which was the reverse case of Enjoy versus Juul, where Enjoy lost. And the other cases, there were a couple of settlements, and then the two pending ones at the very top are both violation cases. So the administrative law judge in those cases has found a violation, and they're waiting for the commission to review. So again, in terms of there are slightly different technologies at issue in these various cases, but what it's resulted in is that there are existing exclusion orders. There are 3 limited exclusion orders, so again, banning the products of the particular respondent companies for vaporizer devices and pods, cartridges, and components thereof. And then there's a separate LEO, one limited exclusion order, and then a general exclusion order, meaning all products are banned. So again, that's one of the advantages of the ITC. You don't have to go respondent by respondent. You can name everybody at one time, and in some of those cases that were up there involving primarily Chinese respondents, there are 45 respondents have been named, and you can do that at the ITC, and then sometimes you can get a general exclusion order, meaning all those products are banned, enforced by Customs and Border Protection. So again, it goes back to the strong remedy involved. I'll just make a couple of caveats if there are folks in the room thinking about this as an alternative, which is the difference between bringing a case at the ITC and in district court. There are a couple of really important gatekeeping mechanisms. The first, going back to my original remarks, Section 337 in the ITC, it's a trade statute, right? So you have to have a domestic industry. But Congress in 1988, recognizing that most of the wealth creation in the United States is by companies who do research and development and design and engineering and not manufacturing per se, amended the statute so a non-practicing entity can establish a domestic industry at the ITC through their, again, research and development, design, engineering. There have been a couple of recent cases which is going to make it a little easier to get into the ITC because now you can include marketing and sales activities as well. So you have to be able to establish a domestic industry to be a complainant at the ITC. You have to establish that your competitors are importing the product. They don't have to necessarily be selling in the United States. Importation's been enough if they bring something into a trade show. So again, this idea to be a first mover and try to block a competitor's product, importation is something that that you need to establish, but it's not very difficult to establish. And then again, your remedy is not damages. You can't file a parallel case in district court. Most companies do, and you can go back and obtain your damages. So in my last couple of minutes with you, I'm just going to I'll just focus on one more thing before I leave Section 337 of the vaping cases, and this is not, you can't see all of it. But the other interesting thing about the ITC is that once the commission decides there should be an exclusion order, the president gets to review it. Again, going back to this being a trade statute, not just a court proceeding, the president can say, I think that the order excluding these types of products will be contrary to the public interest. And there are several public interest factors, so very unique again in this type of litigation. It rarely happens. So there have been, President Reagan had several where he disapproved the commission. President Obama disapproved a ITC order in the smartphone wars. But again, it has to be because it has an adverse impact on the public interest. Either the US company can't supply the market, or it's so important to health and welfare, nuclear, there's a nuclear fusion technology that was one of the issues, one of the cases. So in the vaping world, the commission has, in the early cases, spent a lot of time asking questions about would excluding these competitors' products impact the public interest? And so this is not at all I want to be clear about this is not the ITC weighing in on whether vaping is good or bad. Again, they're agnostic on the technology. It was whether there was something about needing more products in the market that was important. And so several of the judges asked parties to put in a lot of information about what the FDA was saying about vaping products. And so this particular judge, who's the chief judge, Jeannie, had lots and lots of information, but he at the end of the day basically said, keeping these products out doesn't adversely impact the public health. So I hope that makes sense to you, that it wasn't saying vaping is good or bad. It was you don't need more of these vaping products from the infringing technology in order to have the potential health benefits. And that's really what this is about. And I know I'm almost out of time, but I'll just take 2 minutes to talk about trade and tariff policy, even though it's not vape-specific, the president's trade policy. But just going back to first principles, January 20th, President Trump 2.0 came in with a memorandum setting out what he wanted his administration to focus on. They were very focused on trade deficits, national economic security. They were going to use tariffs, including against allies. They're interested in export controls on technology. They wanted to continue to have tariffs on steel and aluminum, which came from the first Trump administration. And they wanted to combat unfair trade practices, and they wanted the whole of government to look at what it can do, the government could do better, more, what avenues were available to the president to combat unfair trade practices. And so that result has been an American first trade policy. So the big takeaway from this, if you look at the first, essentially 200 days of the Trump administration, is it has been the most active administration in terms of taking trade-related actions. Everything in blue is a tariff, so don't have time. I'm happy to, again, talk all day about tariffs and what authority they were imposed under, and we can handicap whether the Supreme Court will find that the president exceeded his authority. But regardless, there were a number of tariffs that were imposed. Those have led to a number of trade agreements. Those are in white. So again, the most major economies have in fact signed an agreement with the United States. Some of the details still coming out. And then there are a number of sector-specific national security studies, Section 232 studies. There is one on pharmaceuticals. Nicotine is not treated as a pharmaceutical, so it's not as relevant, but for those who are in this room who are involved in other types of trade in pharmaceutical products, that particular Section 232 is expected kind of any week. It's been, they've been saying they're going to announce it, but they haven't yet. But that will, again, probably impose tariffs on, continue to impose tariffs on certain imports of pharmaceuticals. The EU was able to carve out its own deal, so the pharmaceutical tariffs will be capped for the EU. And we expect that to happen with a number of these sectorial deals. That if you have a trade agreement with the United States, you probably get a better deal. If you're outside of having a trade agreement and one of these, and your products are in one of these sector specifics categories, which include the auto parts and lumber and copper and aircraft, just a bunch of them, they will likely face higher tariffs. Those particular tariffs, just going back to the legal question for a moment, were unsuccessfully challenged during the Trump administration. So when we talk about Section 232, Trump 1.0 used Section 232 to set the tariffs on steel and aluminum that are in existence today. Those were challenged unsuccessfully. They were found to be an appropriate exercise of presidential authority in a national security context. The challenge now under the so-called IEEPA emergency tariffs is a different challenge, as if you're following along, two lower courts have found that the president did exceed his authority. I spent a lot of time having cases arguing in those courts, and so those were not, I think a lot of people anticipated that, just including at the federal circuit. It broke somewhat along party lines in terms of the majority. It was a 7-4 decision. The 4 dissenters are Republican appointees. What that means for the Supreme Court, I don't claim to be a Supreme Court watcher, but my observation of the Supreme Court is they get so few of these cases that are either intellectual property or trade related that it's hard to predict what they're going to do. So do they lean more on their precedent of you give the president a lot of authority in national security, or do they use the major questions doctrine to see this as exceeding the role of the president? So we'll be watching that along with many others, continuing to advise companies on how they can best protect their intellectual property, protect their innovations, and how trade and tariff policy can be used to influence those things. So thank you for allowing me to go on a little extra to talk about that. And again, happy to talk to you guys at the break.
Deanna, this was absolutely excellent. Thank you so much for this insider perspective. We're coming now to the next speaker, Jeannie Cameron. Please come up to the stage. She has a public international law background as well, so this is a great segment, and she's going to be speaking to you about something very specific that's very important.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you to the team at New Approaches, Martin, Kylie, and Michelle. I'm going to be talking about how to fix the Doggett Amendment. So, what is the Doggett Amendment? It was named after Lloyd Doggett, a Republican from Texas, who in 1997 made an amendment to the annual appropriations bill to prevent USTR, the US Trade Representative, and Commerce and Agriculture from promoting the sale and export of tobacco products to foreign governments. And subsequently, this was endorsed in 2001 by a Clinton executive order. This was also at the same time as the start of the WHO FCTC negotiations and the advent of a strong public health policy focus among US agencies. It was a landmark in tobacco control in the US by stopping US agencies from advocating for tobacco companies overseas in trade policy. But that was more than 25 years ago, and we all know things have moved on since then. Millions have switched and are switching to less harmful nicotine alternatives, to products endorsed by the US public health agencies as being appropriate for the protection of public health. And yet the Doggett Amendment continues to apply to lower risk products, and US agencies are barred from supporting and sharing scientific evidence with foreign governments where smoking rates remain high. Today, if a tobacco or nicotine company seeks USTR help, the Doggett Amendment effectively blocks USTR from acting as their champion to use US trade power to pry open markets for vapes or pouches. Is it time, therefore, for a revision of the Doggett Amendment by Congress to allow federal agencies to share information on proven, scientifically vetted evidence? where US agencies are empowered to share evidence and help smokers access safer alternatives. The US could lead by example in tobacco control by embracing harm reduction in this way rather than ignoring it. At present, all reduced harm products, vapes, pouches and heated tobacco fall under the Doggett umbrella, and USTR cannot push for their export. It's worth noting, however, that if synthetic nicotine is used, USTR could legally act, but in practice, the agency has been very cautious, avoiding any appearance of promoting nicotine products. A practical example of this today would be if US companies wanted to export their safer nicotine products to Australia, for example, which has an effective prohibition. The US company would theoretically go to USTR and say, Australia's banning our reduced harm products while still allowing cigarettes. Please launch a WTO case. Because of Doggett, USTR cannot advocate for safer nicotine products abroad, even in market access negotiations. So an amendment to the Doggett is now very timely. And Derek Yach and I published an article on this recently. Now this brings me to another significant trade policy issue, like products. Like products is a principle in international trade law in terms of non-discrimination, where imported products must not be treated less favourably than domestic like products. There's no definition of like products, but a multi-factor test is applied. 1, physical properties. Do they look and feel the same, have the same ingredients, the same manufacturing process? 2, the end use. Do they have the same purpose? 3, consumer perception. Do consumers see them as substitutes? And 4, the tariff classification. Are they grouped in the same harmonised code? If 2 products are found like, discriminatory treatment between them is presumptively illegal, unless there's an Article 20 protection. Article 20 being under the WTO law, the protection of human health. The WTO EC asbestos case of 2001 gives us some insight. Asbestos and products containing asbestos products were deemed not like, partly because of health risks. The WTO appellate body accepted that health risks is a relevant factor in assessing likeness. The case was significant because it was the first time a WTO party successfully used Article 20 to make a trade justification. It also highlighted the interaction between WTO trade law and non-trade policies like public health and environment. In a case of cigarettes versus harm-reduced products, it is likely, therefore, that the same principle could apply. They would not be deemed like products because of clear differences in physical composition, tariff headings, and arguably on health grounds. And therefore, differential treatment is not a discrimination. Also, if a government banned vapes and pouches while allowing cigarettes, an exporting country could challenge the measure using WTO rules, not necessarily on like product grounds, but on grounds of unnecessary trade restriction under the Technical Barriers to Trade, or the TBT agreement, combined with an Article 20 health protection justification review. The chapeau, or the top part of, introductory part of Article 20, provides for not arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination. In effect, that the distinction is evidence-based and not a disguised restriction on trade, and also that there is a coherent regulatory strategy. Cigarettes equals uniquely deadly, therefore stricter rules. Reduced risk equals potential harm reduction, therefore proportionate regulation. Taking a strategic approach, governments could argue that cigarettes are uniquely harmful, which justifies stricter measures. They could argue that reduced risk products are part of harm reduction, which justifies lighter regulation or even preferential treatment, as long as still health-orientated age restrictions, quality standards, no youth marketing, etc. are adhered to. This differential approach is evidence-based and proportionate, and it avoids the accusation of arbitrary discrimination that often sinks other Article 20 defences. To justify differential treatment, a government could cite that the objective is to protect public health by reducing smoking-related mortality. It could provide evidence from various global independent health sources to support this fact. It could claim necessity grounds that strict regulation on cigarettes is essential, as less restrictive measures are ineffective given the health burden. And it could argue that it is the least trade restrictive measure insofar as the policy differentiates between products proportionately to their health risk and therefore not more restrictive than necessary. On the necessity and proportionality test under Article 20, if a country bans vapes but not cigarettes, complainants can argue that it fails the chapeau test. Banning the safer product or keeping the deadlier one is incoherent, discriminatory, and not necessary. WTO jurisprudence shows this principle was accepted in the case of Brazil and retreaded tyres in 2007, where Brazil restricted the used tyre imports, citing health and environmental risks. The appellate body upheld the Article 20 justification, but struck down inconsistencies or domestic loopholes as arbitrary discrimination. In summary, the principal line of defence in a strategy could be products are not like and therefore there is no discrimination. Even if they are deemed liked, measures are justified under Article 20 of health protection. Measures are not more trade restrictive than necessary and are proportionate based on TBT and international health standards. And evidence, there is overwhelming scientific and global policy consensus that cigarettes are uniquely harmful and warrant stricter rules. So, I hope that what I've outlined provides some food for thought, both in terms of the need to revisit Doggett, the Doggett Amendment, and to consider other trade policy mechanisms that might bring about better health outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeannie. Keeping good on time, Charles Gardner, could you please come up? Charles is a lateral thinker in the field as far as I'm concerned. It's always very interesting what he has to say. He's a former diplomat as well and a practitioner. The floor is yours.
Thank you to the organizers and apologies to all of you for the simplicity of my talk. Let me figure out how do we work this. So this is about why adults shift to or away from safer nicotine alternatives. Affordability is one of three driving factors. When I was a program officer in a previous life at the Rockefeller Foundation, and Derek Yach was my boss, he hasn't aged a bit. We talked about three things because we were developing new drugs and vaccines for HIV, tuberculosis, malaria, and dengue, and there's no point in developing new products unless you can get them to the bedside, to get them to the people who need them. So affordability is one of the three A's. You also need accessibility and acceptability. All of those things are relevant to nicotine vapes and other safer nicotine alternatives. This is a lest we forget slide. Lung cancer is responsible for nearly 1/3 of all smoking-related deaths. But if we accept that there are safer nicotine alternatives to deadly cigarettes, then healthcare is an ethical field, supposedly. In healthcare ethics, we are obligated to make that product more affordable, more palatable or acceptable, and more accessible to the people who need it. Now, which brings us to sin taxes, because those are a coercive measure. They elevate the price of products. And also to what I'm calling a negative tax, which is another word for subsidy. All right? If something is safer, you probably ought to subsidize it. In the same way that we do with, for example, solar power or wind power. Now, sin tax is technically meant to nudge, I'm not sure why the formatting is all messed up, but it's meant to nudge behaviors away from things that we perceive to be harmful or costly to society. And we're all familiar with the concept of product substitution when you have one thing or another thing, for example, electric cars and gasoline engine cars. And in this case, for example, with electric cars, we use subsidies or tax breaks to encourage their use, encourage that shift away from combustion engine cars, except this graph is a lie. I just changed the label. So this is the correct graph. and this is based on the CDC's National Health Interview Survey of adults and the National Youth Tobacco Survey of teens. In some cases, I've had to convert percentages into the absolute numbers you see here. We can see the sheer magnitude of the changes going on and the number of people involved. I did that based on global census data. We have 260 million adults in the United States and 27 million teens. And you can see it's basically a one-for-one product substitution happening, and within about 2 years, there will be more people, adults, vaping nicotine in the United States than smoking deadly cigarettes. Now, this creates a problem in a way, which is sin tax revenue is plummeting at the federal level and at the state level. And these sin taxes are like heroin in the arms of governments. They use this money to pad their budgets, and it's really got to be hitting the states. Now, this is sin tax revenue for tobacco products, and you see some of the biggest states here, but then there, in addition, is the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement, so there's another tranche of billions of dollars, but the MSA payments are pegged to cigarette sales. So as cigarette sales go down, those MSA payments are going down. This creates serious perverse incentives, in my opinion. So what about those e-cigarette sin taxes or sin taxes on other safer nicotine alternatives? I mean, here, Dr. Ken Warner weighed in. He's one of my heroes in the field, and of course he's at my alma mater, the University of Michigan, which we all know is the Harvard of the West. And he's a former president of the Society for Research on Nicotine and Tobacco. Back when we were talking about Build Back Better and an e-cigarette tax, he published a piece in the Washington Post. The proposed tax is going to push people toward the deadly option, product substitution, in the wrong direction. There are a number of papers on this. They're not easy to find. And here we have Nancy Rigotti and others et al. Modeling what would happen if we increase taxes on e-cigarettes, and as you might guess, that may raise use of combustible cigarettes. That would be bad for public health. Michael Pesco and Abigail Friedman, these are all very recent studies, found, actually looking at the natural experiment of where states have raised e-cigarette taxes, that cigarette sales and use increased, especially among young adults. It's kind of not good. Similarly, there are white papers. Flo Foxen and Ariella, I forget her last name, with apologies to Ariella. Meta-analysis shows the same thing, so looking at a number of different cases, but increasing taxes on e-cigarettes, I mean, it's like, this is like child's play. Of course they do. It's going to increase, it's going to decrease the use of the e-cigarettes, and it's going to increase the use of cigarettes. Bad for public health. There are a number of other studies. Again, they're not easy to find, and so most of these studies have found that raising e-cigarette taxes, as to be expected, caused consumers to shift consumption away from the safer product and toward deadly cigarettes. And the thing is, many of these studies are white papers or published in economics journals that I think nobody in public health ever reads. And we're now, I often say there are two schools of thought. When you ask the question, is product substitution happening, right? So if for example, e-cigarettes are a gateway to smoking, then product substitution is not happening. And so if you ask, is product substitution happening? Every health economist will tell you yes. Goldman Sachs is on record saying yes. Big tobacco execs are telling their investors yes. And every Bloomberg grantee is using this particular formulation, smoking is down, comma, but e-cigarette use has increased. Now, this is a statement made based on associations from which you cannot draw any conclusion about causality. That phrasing is deliberately designed to negate causality. It's very interesting. And it's like everybody got the memo. That's the way they say it. So who to believe then? You know, health economists or one U.S. billionaire? Sorry to be snarky. I put this in just as a bibliography because I assume people will have access to the slides in case anybody wants to click on it and see some of the papers I reviewed. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Charles. All right, so this completes the keynotes for the morning. We're going to go into a panel discussion now. So Patricia, if you could come back up to moderate the panel with Agustin, please come up. Dr. Christina Yach, Jeannie, and Anand Ashok. If everybody please could come to the stage.
Thank you, everyone. And while the panelists are gathering, I'll take this opportunity to say a few words about this panel. Our goal is to examine the recent trade protection tariffs and other actions, but also some of the IP patent cases and what impact and results they have concretely for the industry. Hopefully, also we can draw some conclusions regarding, the disproportionate impact on the recent tariffs on things like elements of the supply chain and what will be the concrete results of a longer-term tariff war and all kind of other tariff and trade opportunities, but also challenges that we've seen in particular in the recent year. With that, I will actually start with Agustin, and it's just because we had spoken before, and I know Jeannie wasn't part of our prep meeting. What I would like to do is let every one of the panelists share a little bit of their experience, and then maybe we move into Q&A. We have half an hour, and hopefully we can stay on time. Agustin, thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Patricia. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be back here today again. This is a really unique conference, and these have been some great speeches this morning. I want to just say that I am not I don't practice in tariffs every day. My focus is more on tobacco and nicotine and other highly regulated consumer goods. But I am part of a law firm with 1,600 lawyers and 33 offices, and many of them do practice in tariffs. So I've sort of talked to them a little bit about this topic of today and the area of tariffs more broadly beyond tobacco and nicotine, just to make sure that my views are not inconsistent with the broader landscape. And from what we're seeing and what you've heard earlier today from Deanna Okun, with in very nice detail, I may say, is that escalating tariffs and trade protectionism, especially with respect to China, are already threatening the tobacco and nicotine space with higher import costs and possibly even more disruption if relations continue down this current aggressive path. But it's worth pointing out that these effects are across all sectors and really are not particularly nicotine specific. And you saw in Deanna's presentation that, tariffs were imposed originally at a rate of 20% in response to the China's alleged complicity in fentanyl trafficking. And then there's a reciprocal tariff in place of 10%, which could go up if, and it could go up as early as November 10th if there aren't these issues worked out. Regardless of where the, these federal tariff numbers land, companies in this environment should continue to consider their options with respect to China and adjusting as dealings with China become more expensive and subject to regulatory hurdles. And I'm going to keep these remarks very general for now and allow for others to speak and have some Q&A later. But I will say this tariff agenda is the subject of ongoing litigation. The U.S. Supreme Court is scheduled to hear oral arguments in early November on this issue. And if the Supreme Court upholds the rulings of the lower court, so that's the International Court the U.S. Court of International Trade, which has had a ruling that's been affirmed by the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, then you may see a striking down of some of these additional tariffs. But for now, these fentanyl and reciprocal tariffs remain in effect. And finally, I do want to say that we've had sort of this nationalized political trend across the nation. So we do see some states, particularly Republican-leaning states, that have enacted their own trade protectionist policies. We've seen this in at least 2 states, Texas and Alabama, where there are state efforts to impose restrictions on foreign trade. These are under challenge, but this is legislation to restrict the sale of foreign manufactured e-cigarette products in their jurisdiction. So happy to talk more about that later, but I'm going to leave that for now. Patricia, back to you.
Thank you very much. And one of the beauties of this panel is that we have such a diverse group of people. The next panelist that I'd like to invite to say a few remarks is Dr. Christina Young. She is now advising clients, but in the past has been a public official. So if you'd like to say a few words about your experience, thank you very much.
Sure, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. I think my background's a little different than some folks in the room. So prior to 2009, with the Tobacco Control Act, I was asked by ExxonMobil to invent, build, and characterize a wearable, very small device that could detect benzene and other analytes, but benzene in particular, which was carcinogenic, at very, very low levels in air in real time, which is not something that a commercialized product could do. So why was I asked to do that, right? To meet a regulatory need. It was really difficult. And I spent years on this. I worked in the Princeton University Electrical Engineering Lab with electrical engineers. I worked in chemistry and engineering laboratories for years at Georgia Tech to solve a problem that couldn't be solved, to meet a regulatory need. And so your intellectual property is incredibly important, right? It's what your company's based on. It's your inventions. You've spent many years building this work. And this field requires innovative approaches for public health needs. That's really tough to do. And so the challenges that are being faced that we'll talk about on this panel today, one being illicit trade and fluctuations in tariffs, begs the question, okay, how can you protect your innovation, which is critical to this space, right? And then also, how do you remain compliant with FDA CTP's requirements, right? So following working for ExxonMobil, I was at the Center for Tobacco Products at the very beginning, back when we only had 30 employees, actually in the Office of Science. And I was there for over half a decade. And so I understand also how difficult it is to meet the Center for Tobacco Products requirements. So how do you do both, right? How do you continue to meet CTP's regulatory compliance and remain compliant, and also innovate and also solve problems that need to be solved for public health?
Thank you very much, Christina. The next panelist, you've heard her already, but I think this is an opportunity to elaborate perhaps on a slightly different aspect of her expertise, Jeannie Cameron.
Oh, okay, thank you. I was expecting Anand next. I think from those who listened to what I spoke about, a lot of it was very sort of theoretical and academic in a sense, but what it requires is a strong government, perhaps the US, to actually move and be a first mover and take a case and do something if it really wants to stand up for this issue and for the companies and the industry that is operating in its space. I think one of the things that's interesting is that with WTO law or trade law, it does require a government to actually take the action. So it does need, and that's been lacking for some years, of course, on this issue, because no government really wants to stand up and promote this and take on cases against other governments. But there is this strong sort of trade reason and a very clear public health rationale behind it. When you can compare this with another side where I think there's also quite a bit of inaction is on like the human rights treaties and things like that. The human rights treaties, as opposed to the WTO, sort of, which requires a government, have optional protocols which allow individuals to specifically take cases to the relevant human rights body to say that their rights have been denied by domestic local policy. So Article 12 of the, I think it's the Convention on, I'll remember that in a minute, but it's one of the two big 1966 treaties. It has a right to health, and all of the things that we talk about actually have the right for the highest attainable level of human health an individual can have. Now, when I worked in the government in Australia many years ago in the Prime Minister and Cabinet Department, back in the 90s, there was a case taken against Australia on this by two individuals, not on this issue, of course, on another issue, and it was won, and it forced Australia to change its domestic policy. I've been talking about this and writing some articles for some years. I just wonder why no individual vapers or groups of vapers have organised enough in one of the countries to actually take this forward. And I have mapped out how that could happen. The same thing, I think, on what I was talking about on trade. It requires a government to look strategically at this, that wants to support the industry in its country to sort of break open things and promote harm reduction using trade law policy. So I think on the both hands, we as a group who know about these issues, and that also goes to Doggett. I mean, what I was saying about that, it really is time to change that and allow USTR to actually promote something that the FDA and others have indicated is essential for the protection of public health. So unless I mean, they can do that now with any product that uses synthetic nicotine, which I think is important for manufacturers who may wish to use that in order to then be able to push USTR to do that in the US. But, you know, these are the sorts of strategic things I think we ought to be looking at.
Thank you, Jeannie. And another extremely interesting panelist that we have today is actually a representative of the supply chain of the entire nicotine industry, Anand Ashok, who will share a very practical and somewhat different angle than everyone else on the panel. Please.
Sure, thank you. So really excited to be here and to speak to so many interesting people. So look forward to networking a little bit later also. So I'm Anand Ashok, as mentioned. I'm the CEO of Xanoprima. We are a pharmaceutical company, but we focus on the nicotine space in terms of supply. We have developed IP in the space. The core IP that we have is our process for the production of synthetic nicotine, S-nicotine, directly, which is directly comparable to what comes from tobacco. Now, this was developed from the pharmaceutical angle, so we wanted a clean nicotine, which also provided a lot of other potential benefits. For example, environmental, which I'll talk about a little bit in the session later, high purity, and also some additional benefits in taste and odor compared to the incumbents at the time when we came up with that. The other things, the other two key areas where we have intellectual property patents, we have a vaping formulation which we look to approach from, again, a pharmaceutical angle where we're looking to reduce the harm to potential users, and also we have a novel pouch formulation which looks to do the same. As mentioned, we'll speak about this a little bit later. I want more people to come to my presentation at 4:40, so don't want to give too much away.
With regards to this panel in particular, what the key things that I would like to bring are the trade angle, which obviously as a UK headquartered business with manufacturing in India and R&D in both India and the UK, supplying globally, particularly into the US in the current environment, we've had to go through quite a few different challenges. This ranges from the tariff angle, which has meant that a lot of our clients have obviously looked to shift their supply chains, whether that's to the US or whether it's actually quite funneling some business into other geographies which happen to remain tariff-free. I think we can guess which ones some of those might be. So it's had a very different, let's say, effect depending on companies. They've looked to have quite different strategies on that. It's also interesting because pharmaceuticals was mentioned a little bit earlier, and while nicotine itself is not a pharmaceutical, there are some derivative products of nicotine which do come under this category. So at the moment, these remain unchanged. We will wait and see what impact is to come, but that's something that we're following very closely as well. The other thing that I'd like to talk a little bit about is a big challenge that I'm sure a lot of people in this room have seen and faced over the years, which has been around the creation of IP. Now, we came into this space, like everyone in this room, to look to make some benefit to public health. Maybe others have different agendas, but the point is that we've had to fight our corner very strongly, particularly around our IP for our synthetic nicotine, where it's a process patent that we have. So a few years ago, and this the full judgment is actually on our website, we've actually had to take on infringers based in China, and we did come out on the successful side, but I can imagine this to be a big challenge for a lot of people within the industry also, where they have to face infringers. We're simply looking to do the right thing, but we have to face infringers, we have to fight our corner, and maybe not everyone is quite as fortunate to get through the other side as we are. So I'll be really keen to take some additional questions on that. I'll stop talking and let the others also chime in there. Thank you.
Thank you. We do have about 12 minutes for questions, and without further ado, I'd like to open it to the room. And I know Derek has some opinions on this topic, and others. Let's have some questions for the panel. I have some questions of my own, but I'd like to very much start with the audience, because ultimately we're here for you, and we're here. You have these great experts, people with very diverse sets of experience, and I'll be very happy to take your questions. Yes, somebody has the microphone, and they will be coming slowly to your. If you raise your hand, please.
Thanks, Robert, and thank you for the prompt, Patricia. Really excellent panel. I mean, I think this is a unique panel. I haven't heard this level of discussion either being reported with the seriousness that it deserves. And so my question is really expecting speculation in terms of your answers, but maybe speculation that could lead to many of you and others doing deeper work, including building on what Deanna said. And it's really based upon the question of what are the likely impacts of the changes that we've seen in tariffs in terms of the pricing for consumers, the shifts in production that we're likely to see, the changes in supply chains, and the differential effects that this may have, for example, of some countries willing to reinvest in tobacco growing to lower the costs of imports, other countries shifting production, which we know is happening across a number of Asian countries already. But in the end, what we really want to know is what is likely to be the net impact on the price of a classic cigarette compared to many of our products. And as a simple-minded epidemiologist, it would strike me that the cigarette has an advantage that it probably will be most immune to major tariff shifts because it has a less complex supply chain. It's less dependent upon the places where the tariffs are likely to go up highest. And so it may become even more affordable. The nicotine pouch, on the other hand, may be the biggest winner of all, because presumably if you can grow and produce in one place, and we know there's large investments in the US already happening, that may make the affordability even greater on the nicotine pouch. But I think this is important because we want to start projecting forward what is this going to mean for the price and the access of the individual consumer. So just a couple of speculations, and is this something that should be looked at and discussed to a great extent? Thanks.
Thank you. Agustin, would you like to say a few words maybe from your experience?
Sure. I'll try. There's a lot of great questions in there. And I definitely call my colleagues here to weigh in. I guess I agree with you going backwards that nicotine pouches may be advantaged here because the e-cigarette, vis-a-vis the e-cigarette, vis-a-vis the cigarette, vis-a-vis the cigarette, I'm not so sure. Because I think the cost reduction still is relatively low, and there are other elements happening out there like duty drawback and other things that are helping to subsidize the cost of cigarettes vis-a-vis other products by using the federal excise tax subsidy that comes from the duty drawback. I haven't talked to anybody about that later. But I think that e-cigarettes are an interesting kind of thing to make because of the devices. But I do think that you'll see e-liquids being driven back onshore in the United States at least. And then finally, I just think it's more complex to make an e-cigarette versus a nicotine pouch. I'm just a lawyer, I'm not a business person, but it seems intuitive. So I think that we'll continue to see nicotine pouches have a cost advantage in that respect, unless you see excise taxes being driven across the country, which right now on nicotine pouches I'm not seeing that, but it's coming.
Thank you. And Christina, I know we were talking about IP, so to add complexity to that, it would be great to bring on shores a number of things, but then from what I know, the patent space in both nicotine pouches but also vaping products is so cluttered, and to the untrained eye, a lot of those patents seem so overlapping, I'm sorry to say. So what would be some of your thoughts on what Derek just asked in terms of consequences if we add the complexity of, how much heavier, or how many more patents there are in the pouch and also vaping space compared perhaps to cigarettes?
I mean, I think there's some things that you can do to be proactive, right, and vigilant about it. In terms of, keeping an eye on your own IP and keeping an eye out for infringement, right? And then also, I think from, the claim construction perspective, draft strong IP to begin with, right? I mean, this is an innovative, novel space, right? So there are, more and more patents being, filed in this space accordingly. And there do seem, to be overlap in some spaces, but I think to the trained eye, right, how the product is commercialized, right, and compared against how it's commercialized and how it is in the patent is quite important. So I think it takes, a niche experience sometimes to really leverage synergy between those that are the inventors and really understand the technology very well, and then have a cross-section with what I finally call our legal beagles, lawyers, right? But just, ones that understand the technology enough to be able to leverage substantive legal arguments to help protect your IP, right? And then also have a cross-section with, obviously, the business at stake that owns the IP, right? It's really a team effort. But it's the same in response to anything from CTP for your PMTA, I think is very closely paralleled with a response in, patent litigation for infringement, right? Very deep scientific and engineering expertise, not understanding just what it is, the IP itself, but how it's applied and how it's used to solve problems, right?
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And Ashok, you mentioned India, and of course everyone knows what devastating consequences, obviously for a trade with India, some of the recent measures announced or implemented might have. do you see a huge disadvantage? Do you see the nicotine pouch industry and especially the liquid, obviously, industry coming at a huge disadvantage with the new tariffs? And concretely, what would your clients do, I don't want to say to circumvent, but to address and mitigate, because, one solution would be perhaps more government affairs, interactions with the various governments. But if you can share some of those with us.
Sure. So if we look at the trade data, you can see that a vast majority of the nicotine supply comes from India as it is, whether it's, obviously we supply synthetic, but if we look at the tobacco dried, that is the case. Realistically, at this stage, we've seen, I guess, from our side especially, relatively small differences in the way people have been approaching it, largely because, as mentioned, if you're talking over 80% of the nicotine coming from India, you can't change that overnight. There is going to have to be some infrastructure put in place in the first instance. The other thing is that when you look at being cost competitive, even when you take the tariffs into account at this stage, it's very difficult to set up that infrastructure, whether it's growing the leaf domestically and then being able to refine that into nicotine through the extraction process. So as a result, we haven't really seen that impact yet, I would say, but we are seeing some of our clients looking to see how they can shift more of that supply chain into the US, whether it's through taking, let's say, nicotine at a cruder stage, for example. Do we finish refining that in the US? You still end up having some of these issues of the tariffs for that. So that can be a challenge. The other thing that we are seeing a lot of, in fact, a lot of our existing clients who have been manufacturing typically nicotine pouches in India and then shipping, they are looking at the Middle East as a potential place where they can do some of this manufacturing, because if you do significant value add, then you are able to ship from there to the US, essentially tariff-free. So it's an interesting time. There's a lot of flux. And if I can just pick up on Derek's question as well, actually, on the price, the one thing that I should mention here is that when you look at the nicotine pouches themselves, well, fortunately or unfortunately for people like us, the actual cost of the nicotine in there is relatively small. It's so if you look at what is reaching the end product, the end customer, the impact can be minimal. You're probably likely to see overall just reduction, very slight reduction of margins, and potentially, and potentially fewer taxes, dare I say, indirectly coming through as a result.
So I seem to hear you say that the tariffs actually do work to stimulate, bringing back some of the manufacturing to the U.S., but that's really not realistic or practical for certain industries, and there may be complexities. One more quick question, please.
Hi. Thank you so much for your presentations this morning. My name is Lawson Bernstein. I'm a physician. I work at a large inner-city hospital here in New York City. I'm interested in harm reduction because everybody I see is at risk. I was interested in hearing Ms. Cameron's presentation this morning. Your discussion about the chapeau and the differences between nicotine products is one of the most eloquent separations I've heard between the risk of combustible tobacco versus other products. Within the medical ecosystem, it's very ossified. It's very difficult to talk about this. It's a taboo. It struck me as I heard you speak that if you took that spotlight and you turned around and you faced it at the US, would that be an argument for access? That is to say, is depriving US citizens or residents of access to this type of product not only a public health issue in a moral sense of the term, but also in a trade or product access sense of the term? I know it's a little off topic and I apologize, but I was wondering what your thoughts would be.
Yes, I do. I certainly do think it's an area that's been, I think, ignored for so long, the trade side of things, because even if you look at the differences between, say, like products or not or others, between nicotine replacement therapies like patches and other things, and nicotine, say, in a pouch, you know, they're treated very different in a regulatory perspective. So I think, you know, people who are, you know, significant trade lawyers ought to be, in my view, really delving into this on behalf of those that produce these products and all of the supply chains which go into that. And to your point of could it do market access for the US, it is a little more difficult in that the US is the only country really, I think possibly Philippines, but the only country in the world that has an authorization system compared to a notification system for vaping products, or for vaping essentially. So in Europe and everywhere else in the world, pretty much, I'm being very general here, as long as you meet certain standards and you notify like in the UK, the MHRA, Medical Health and Regulatory Authority, and your product meets these standards, and you've gone through, checking, it can take 6 weeks to put your nicotine product onto the market. Similarly in Europe, etc. Whereas in the US, you have to go through the pre-market tobacco authorization, which can take years, it can cost millions, and only a few companies can go through that process, which means to be able to be selling a vaping product or a nicotine product in the US market, there's a lot more money needed, there's a lot more time needed, and a whole lot of other stuff, which makes the US particularly difficult for products coming in because they can't, come in without having a market authorization. So that puts an extra complexity into that. But I do think, there's some very clever trade lawyers around who could really start looking at these things in comparisons. I think from what I've been understanding, there is, I'm not too detailed on the US FDA, but it is looking at softening some of the regulatory requirements at the moment, and how that's shaped and how policymakers look at that. I think the health secretary seems to be quite open-minded from what I can gather, and so potentially now is the right time to start talking across, nicotine is a chemical, whether it's in this product or that product or that product. It really shouldn't be discriminated against in a trade basis. But I do think that the power of the US to be the country to take up cases against other governments for non-access of products might start to, and therefore, changing the Doggett Amendment to enable USTR to start talking about the benefits in a way that they haven't done been able to talk to for some years, would start to really change that international perspective, I think. But I'm happy to talk to you more about it later.
Thank you. We've come to the end of our panel and the allocated time. I wish to thank the panelists, the audience, and of course, everyone is open for private conversations during the upcoming coffee break. Thank you.